Wim Wenders' Land of Plenty, released 2004. It's a post 9/11 delve into how the American public, through a few examples, reacting or acting in the face of the attack that took place on 2001. And Wenders is quite a liberal director, but it appears from the brief review that I've read that he's looking at the cross-section of opinions as to how to respond, from the Muslim xenophobic right-wing stance to the liberal, how are we going to save them sort of a response on the left. And it stars Michelle Williams. Let's go for it. A strange beginning as they sort of go through the cast members. It's sort of almost like a sort of technology grid with its sort of sensory movement and glitches in a sort of a rather colourful montage of society, I guess. We're in downtown LA and we're with a surveillance team in a vehicle monitoring the movements of the public and vehicles in a street. This is clearly supposed to reflect the impact of the 9/11 attacks and the increased surveillance in response to this within America, and particularly urban environments. 2 years on, 2003. Some sort of media is captured briefly with a guy critical of liberal comment on the anniversary of the attacks, deeming it inappropriate. This guy, who's part of a surveillance team, he spots a package, a bag, with no one near it. He's about to go and investigate it. This is all linked with this obsession that every unattended package was a bomb, or is likely to be a bomb. And then a woman comes to retrieve it, and he shows his irritation that she's not cooperating to make his working day nice and easy. Strange. The said surveillance officer then spots two Arabs having a conversation and reports this in as suspicious. God, they were really fucking freaked out, weren't they? One of these men has two boxes, and on the side of the box is the word borax. The officer pursues him after having problems starting the vehicle, and then realises he can't see him, he's lost him, and he describes him as a suspect. A suspect of what? Walking? Then we have Michelle Williams' character who's first signing on a plane, listening to some sort of podcast that's feeding her the notion that she's now returned home to safe lands. She comes out of the airport at LA, and she's met by a man. She knows the man, and she's come from Israel, Tel Aviv. She's just got a backpack on her. The surveillance man is Paul, who's the uncle of Lana, played by Williams, who spent time in Israel and is a sort of Christian do-gooder raised by missionary parents. The link is that her brother is the surveillance guy. She arrives anyway at LAX and she starts to work at an inner city homeless shelter operated by Henry, played by Wendell Pierce, who collects her at the airport. And that's the low-tech surveillance van and its inhabitants are described as gung-ho voluntary investigations folk, and they are somewhat xenophobic towards Muslims, Muslim terrorists and liberals. Henry, played by Pierce, is a sort of a minister. He's black, of course, and with Lana they coast round the deprived parts of LA to capture a picture of the extent of the problem with the homeless, which is extensive. On the other hand, Paul is berating the fact that he's at a private airfield and that the airplanes on that airfield have very little security and could be easily stolen. These are sort of small one-seater, two-seater aircraft having absolutely nothing in common with the huge air machines that were aimed at the World Trade Center. Looking at the review of this movie, the critic points out that when the vendor's intention was to deliver a wake-up call that the US had lost its way as it was becoming obsessed and paranoid with regard to suspects, and that losing sight of the fact that poverty was the priority rather than a preoccupation with the war on terror and their response by placing a large contingent of their armed forces in Iraq and later Afghanistan as part of the homeland security. The film shot, we're using digital cameras. The uncle is in fact a Gulf War veteran. It appears that two reviews describe Paul as a Vietnam vet and one as a Gulf War vet. I suppose we've got to go with the Vietnam vet, but I'm trying to work out. He must be in his 50s, yeah. That's probably. Once settled in, Lana commits herself to her laptop and watches religious ceremonies for those who have died possibly through terrorist attacks. The Uncle Paul inquisitively asks a zapped out colleague about borax and its possible link with a dirty bomb. So these are the characters that we're growing to understand in the early stages of this movie. Aside from working at the mission in the kitchens, assisting in giving food to the homeless, she's also wanted to try and track down her Uncle Paul, the guy who's doing the surveillance job. So she sets out in search of him. She has an address. Then she comes across this wacky guy outside her uncle's address, and he's very sheepish and eventually writes down a number so that she can contact him. This is really slow, this movie. Wenders. It's dry. Alana tries to make contact via the number, but Paul refuses to pick up. Eventually Paul rings the number, which is it's a public phone, and his niece answers it. There's a sort of information exchange, but his depth of paranoia is such that he doesn't acknowledge the fact that she's a relative, and her sort of desire to meet him is completely ignored, as he sort of thanks her for some info as to where the call is and where its location is, and then hangs up. Back to her laptop, and somewhat confusing as it's sort of described. It appears that she's pretending through her emails or SMSs that she's back in Israel, or maybe that's where her friend is, Yale. We'll see. Paul in his van, surveying an empty car park, appears to have a conversation with himself, an imaginary one, where he's back in Vietnam, surveying the location of Charlie. Of course, Charlie being the Viet Cong. So he's certainly wacky, and his niece appears to have had some of that wackiness rubbed up on her. Within the confines of his van, he's experiencing an increasingly agitated angst, and ventilating it, all this pent up aggression towards Muslims, of course, who are responsible for 9/11, but part of it is probably carried over from Vietnam and his bigoted view towards Gooks. What a mess. Wenders is certainly portraying this perception, this false sense of reality through Paul, and to an extent Lana, and in that respect it's quite good. We then get Lana in the confines of her room. She starts to have a conversation with the God Almighty, atypical of these religious fanatics. The conversation that Lana has involves her taking both parts, talking to God and God responding to her. It's really very much a symptom of quite a damaged mind. At the mission now, handing out food. Why don't we catch a brief conversation with one? It becomes quite uppity about Lana's sort of jovial, happy-go-lucky attitude. He's clearly got a chip on his shoulder, and of course he's black and she's white, but he can't understand why she's so friendly when she doesn't even know his name. Paul has accepted food there as well. He sleeks out the back. He seems to be putting two to two together with regard to Lana, but he still isn't prepared to say hello. As Paul leaves, he spots a Muslim arriving for some food, and I think it's possibly the same one he saw with the box of borax, because he immediately gets back to his van and starts engaging his surveillance equipment. As the Muslim emerges, of course Paul follows him, and he appears to, the Muslim that is, appears to buy some more borax, which of course is a cleansing agent. Paul jibs sarcastically. Must be a lot of washing to be done. We then see late at night when the Muslim who's been under surveillance, so to speak, is trying to put together some sort of tent to sleep rough, yet he's still the subject of intense scrutiny by this surveillance guy Paul. It's almost hysterical if it wasn't so racist. Then while this guy is across the street, out of the blue, this car drives past, a Molotov cocktail is thrown into the tent area, and as the Muslim runs out, he's shot dead. Paul comes across as a crowd gathers outside. It's because it's outside the soup kitchen area, and he tries to give CPR to the victim, but to no avail. And then, interestingly, he comments about Lara, who's there, Lisa, and says that she looks like a mother or sister. Throughout the movie there's been a number of interesting music added to the experience, and I don't actually know. It's modern music, and there's another now which sounds really good. Great choice of music by Wenders. Paul, of course, recorded the footage of this incident, and now, in the aftermath, he's monologuing all these conspiracy theories about this man being part of a cell ring, and that he was targeted for some greater plan. It's complete and utter balderdash. When Paul was in Vietnam, he was in an area that was contaminated with Agent Orange or Agent Pink, and he continues to suffer symptoms from time to time, and back at his sort of residence pad with the other guy who's a bit wacky, he starts to exhibit this sort of, like he's experiencing ligament pain or something like that. The murder leads to two responses. One from the girl who wants to find his family to inform them of the death, and two, Paul wants to follow a trail which he's opened up that suggests there's China involved in some use for borax, and he's got all these conspiracy theories. Paul's obsession is clearly seen. He goes on into these premises and spots a car tidily wrapped up in blue PVC, suspicious, takes photo. Then he sees some cylinders, could be water cylinders, large ones, takes photo. He seems to be completely paranoid and obsessed at anything and everything that he comes across with regard to a connection to the terrorist attack of 2001. Agent Pink visually seen on his neck. Paul's phone even has the Star Spangled Banner as its ringtone, would you believe it? Cut to the chase. Laws found out where this guy who's been killed resides, his family, half-brother, and informs Paul, and now they're going to take the body back to the family. Paul is still suspicious that there might be something in it, but that's the plan. And they're now on the road with the corpse in the back. He decides to share some thoughts on the Vietnam War and starts off by claiming that the US won. So we've now got a pretty good idea of where his brain is. To justify this statement, he cleverly connects what took place in Vietnam with what later took place in Germany at the Berlin Wall, and the bringing down communism, and seems to think that the two are linked, having of course forgotten about the fact that the vast majority of the Soviet state has now become a large number of countries that are largely following a similar model to the Soviet regime, and Vietnam are hardly radically now falling over themselves to become a sort of satellite for the US, but that's by all the Wenders has put together this, and it's no coincidence that this sort of character that he's created seemed to embody the type of American that we now seen in abundance since the Trump era. This sort of false reality, and describing the reality as fake news. They arrive in Trona, and Wenders puts it, seems to feel the need for the camera to home in on a sign regarding Presbyterian Church. Maybe he's one step ahead of us here. Lorna decides to go out to the house to try and track down the relative. There's somebody watching them. She's provided with a walkie-talkie by Paul, who wants to get into sort of surveillance mode. Paul, with his audio blog, announces that Trona is within distance from the epicenter of Los Angeles. Perfect place to launch an attack. This guy is completely nuts. Paul, I guess, arrives at some sort of government church, maybe, to place the body there, or keep it there. Lana not getting very far, tracking the relative, and eventually this man with a golf club in green appears walking towards the batch. Paul gets sidetracked by two men who start to load empty boxes. They've got borax written on their side, but he interprets this as something that's suspicious. The victim's male relative seems quite, how can I put it, quite safe and quite appreciative, and invites her to take tea with him, as he then shows her photos of him with the deceased. It's an interesting observation. If I'd watched this movie back in 2004, it's likely that I would have interpreted it as a natural response to a level of anxiety that existed. But now, moving forward, knowing that there are folk who are still functioning psychologically the same, and they haven't moved forward, it really does reflect on the fact that the white race in the US are constantly fearful, frightened, and psychologically sick. To the sound of Bowie, Paul decides to check out this building. It's sort of a house of some description. Cautiously enters and then bashes down the door, and he's got his sort of special glasses on, a gun in his hand, and he finds an elderly woman propped up in bed looking quite ill. The woman comments on how odd he looks with his special glasses. I guess they're sort of special vision glasses or whatever, to see in the dark. So, and she then starts to chunter on about the fact that the remote to the TV isn't very functional. She can't change channels, and the only thing she can alter is the volume control. He stands there speechless. One slap to the top of the TV, and the ability to change channels is restored, and she thanks him. Well, how bizarre. Although further contact with his screwy mate is very much part of the coast, part of the course. He's exhibiting now through his facial that he realised what a twat he is, and that his judgment was very faulty in this supposed sort of observation and infiltration of this alleged threat, which turns out to be some old woman lying up in bed watching TV. The cause becomes evident. His mate, screen mate, contacts him. Some young youths high on crystal meth did it for a bit of fun. You know, let's pick on the Pakistani. This whole sort of perceived sense of what he views as this conspiracy, this reality, is complete bullshit, and it's hit him now in the face. if there's nothing in all the effort that he's been putting into to suggest anything wrongdoing. It's a reality check to his paranoia, his post-traumatic stress disorder from Vietnam, I guess. She slips away to the motel, busy sort of online with her friend in Israel, and then Paul staggers in. He's half cut for certain. He then has this really frightening nightmare recall of his time in Nam, and his eyes are sort of catatonic in nature as he sort of relives the trauma. Lana makes a sort of plea to God in her thoughts. Oh dear, what a pair. Lana brought a letter for Paul. It's Lana's father. He's approaching his own mortality. Lana and Paul now recall their thoughts, views, feelings at the time that the World Trade Centers collapsed, were hit, and then later collapsed in New York. She, of course, wasn't in New York, he was in Israel. He describes a sort of feeling that, like his view of America, the initial impact had been insufficient. The towers were still standing, and then when they collapsed, his thought changed. She then relates to Paul that where she was, ordinary people, not terrorists, ordinary people, were cheering and celebrating as the destruction was taking place. And Wenders is now getting to eulogise on what that all meant in terms of death, the image that America had in other parts of the world, which wasn't cordial. Poignant comment by Lana, suggesting that the victims of 9/11 wouldn't wish any others to die in their name because of their passing, and then we go forward with the help of a Leonard Cohen song. They then arrive after driving for hours, days, at the site of the World Trade Center in New York, and contemplate, reflect, share